Afternoon, everyone. Great to see you. Thank you for joining. We're ready to begin today's Torah portion, which is Vayishlach. If you happen to be following in the Blue Ox Scroll Chumash, it is found on page 170. So this week's Torah portion is the continuation of a series of Torah portions, which began 2 weeks ago with the birth of the twin brothers, Jacob and Esau. And if you've been following the story, as I'm sure you have been, Jacob and Esau were twins, but very different personalities. And Jacob was the second born, but he was grasping the heel of his brother Esau. That's why he was called Yaakov, because Yaakov means heel grabber, because he wanted to be the firstborn. And then he ultimately found this opportunity to purchase the birthright from his brother, acquiring it for a bowl of soup. And then he ultimately is able to receive the blessings from his father Isaac with the help of his mother by disguising himself as Esau. As a result of that, his brother wanted to take revenge. He had to run away. He ran away to the house of his uncle Laban, spent 20 years there, married his 4 wives, had his 12 sons and his 1 daughter, Dinah. And now he has to leave Laban's house because Laban is not on good terms with him either, because he's jealous of him because he became so successful. So now he's on the way home. Now he hasn't seen his brother in over 20 years, and he's concerned about whether his brother's rage and anger had subsided and whether his brother was at peace with him after all of this time that they had been apart. And so the name of the Torah portion is Vayishlach, and he sent. Who sent? Jacob sent. Who did he send? Malachim. And we'll talk about the word Malachim in a moment. He sent Malachim, which either means messengers or angels, to his brother Esau, back in the land of Seir, in the land of Edom, in the land of Israel, saying to his brother, to see how his brother is faring and whether he has to be concerned about coming home after all these years. So, what happens? The angels or the messengers, which we'll talk about in a minute, come back and they have bad news. What's the bad news? They say, we went to your brother and turns out he's heading in your direction. Why is he heading in your direction? Because he's coming with 400 soldiers and he's bent on your destruction. Now, going back to the word malachim, what exactly did Jacob send? So the word malach, we all know an angel. That's the word. But a malach could be a messenger, because a malach is an agent, a messenger, an emissary, an ambassador, a representative of God in this world. So you could either take it figuratively, that it's not real angels. You just send messengers. He sent some of his servants. However, Rashi, who's the classic commentary on the text, on the very first comment on this Torah portion, makes it very clear. Vayishlach Yaakov Malachim, Jacob sent angels, Malachim Mamash, literal angels. So here we get into a concept that a tzaddik, a righteous person, has spiritual powers, not just physical powers, and can operate on that level. And Jacob was able to summon human beings who were really angels, disguised as human beings. And we know that angels sometimes appear in the form of humans. We remember the story of when Abraham had a circumcision, God sent 3 angels that were disguised as humans. So he sends angels on this mission to deal with his brother Esau. So that's just a fascinating point, that a tzaddik, a righteous person, can summon angels on their behalf. Now, this is a lengthy subject. It gets a little spiritual, but it actually says in Pirkei Avot that every time we do a good deed, we create an angel, a good angel, an advocating angel. On the other hand, when we commit a sin, we create a prosecutary angel. So not only Yaakov is creating angels or dispatching angels, we too send angels out into the world through our actions, whether good or bad, unfortunately. But not everyone's in touch with their angels, so to speak. Not everyone has direct communication. Not everyone has the eyes to see and be able to interact with their angels. But Jacob was able to do that. Now, what does he tell the angels to tell his brother? He sends a message to his brother. And listen to the message. He says, so shall you say, and here's the first word you have to notice, La'adoni le'esav, to my master to Esav. Notice the deferential respect and treatment that he gives his older brother. When you want to be at peace with somebody, when you want to make amends, when you want to reconcile and live in harmony, you have to be exceedingly humble sometimes, to the point that we may call it flattery, but it's extreme honor and respect. Okay, it's interesting that in modern Hebrew we say Mr., right, or Mrs. In Hebrew they say Adoni. Adoni is my master in the literal meaning, but it's a way of saying sir, or your honor, so to speak. But it's a common term, so it's a show of great respect for somebody. So even though Jacob is the righteous brother, his brother Esav was not righteous, but yet he shows him respect. And our rabbis learned from this that, Jacob and Esav was the first confrontation. I mean, Ishmael and Isaac had their challenges too, but here's a direct attack where Esav is out to destroy him. Esav is bringing soldiers, 400 men, to fight and destroy Jacob and his family. So this is the first story in the Torah of a Jew, meaning Jacob, the Jewish people. They were more like a family, but the birth of the Jewish nation, dealing with an enemy that seeks its destruction. Now, sadly, the story of the Jewish people and its enemies will repeat itself, countless times throughout Jewish history. As we all know, the famous passage that we say in the Haggadah, in every generation they rise up to kill us. And the rabbis have always studied the story of Vayishlach and how Jacob prepares for battle to learn how we should conduct ourselves in confronting adversaries. And it comes down to three things: protection, and in no particular order: protection, prayer, and prevention. PPP. Protection, Jacob gets ready to fight. He prepares his family. He devises a plan, a strategy, a military strategy. The second thing is prayer. He prays to God. Protect me, save me, rescue me from the hands of my brother. And the final thing is prevention. He tries to prevent it from occurring by sending lavish gifts to his brother to appease him with words of honor and respect and love to his brother. And that's what our rabbis tell us each and every one of us must do. A Jew has to be prepared to fight. Look at the IDF today. We have to be prepared, of course, to pray. We have to recognize our help comes from Hashem. Hashem will bless the work of our hands, but we have to ask God for his assistance and deliverance. And then we also have to do whatever we can to avoid a conflict in the first place, to try to use, as we call today, diplomacy, whether it means giving gifts or overtures or honor, diplomacy to avoid a conflict from occurring. So notice he says, so shall you say to my master, Esav, and then he takes it a step further. Ko amar avdecha Yaakov, so has spoken, so has said your servant Jacob. He refers to his brother as his master and he as his servant. And later in the story, you're going to see when he approaches his brother, he bows 7 times as he approaches his brother. Again, exceedingly humble in order to win the peace. In other words, when your ego gets in the way, unfortunately, that sadly is the cause of a lot of conflict. And in order to make peace, sometimes you have to first go to war against your own ego in order to make peace with someone else. So Jacob shows us how exceedingly humble he acts, even though you may say it wasn't absolutely genuine, because did he really think he was the servant of Esav? But for the sake of peace, a person should be willing to humble themselves in order to get a positive outcome. So what does he say to his brother? He says, I've sojourned with Laban, and I have delayed, I have tarried until now, meaning it took me 20 years to come home. Okay. Then he goes on to say, I have acquired oxen, donkeys, flocks, servants, maidservants, and I'm sending to tell my Lord to find favor in your eyes. And we're going to see he sends him lavish gifts of animals. Now, I have to share with you what Rashi says. This is a very classic and famous Rashi. We all know there are 613 commandments, 248 positive, corresponding to the 248 limbs of the body and organs, and 365 negative commandments, corresponding to the 365 days on the solar calendar. So the combination of all the positive and negative commandments, 248 plus 365, is 613. In Hebrew, the letters are Taryag. Taf, Resh, Yud, Gimel. Taf is 400, Resh is 200, Yud is 10, and Gimel is 3. He says, Im Lavan Garti, I sojourned with Laban. Now, the word sojourned in Hebrew is Garti, the same 4 letters as Taryag, which means if you add up the letters of the word I sojourned, it equals 613. And Rashi said there was a hidden secret message, a code message, laden in this correspondence. He says, I sojourned with Laban, who was a wicked person, an idolater as well, a dishonest human being, a scoundrel. But even in the house of Laban, I performed and observed all 613 commandments. Now, what we have here is a number of things. The first thing is a big fundamental concept that we could talk about for a long time, but just that you know, in case you don't know, that even though the Torah was not given till Mount Sinai through Moshe Rabbeinu, through Moses, which happens many years later, 500 years, let's say, later, there is a tradition that the patriarchs and the matriarchs were already told in advance what the commandments were, so to speak, an advanced copy of the Torah, and they performed the Torah on a voluntary basis, even before it was given, before they were commanded. So it's not really a surprise that Jacob said, I kept the Torah in the house of Laban, even though the Torah had not been given at Mount Sinai, because that's the tradition we have, that they kept the Torah. And there's a lot to be discussed on that. There is a fundamental difference between the Torah before it was given to after it was given. After it was given, it's a covenant with God. It's therefore obligatory, as opposed to the patriarchs who did it voluntarily. But believe it or not, our performance of commandments is higher and greater than the patriarchs and the matriarchs, because they did not have the ability to bring godliness into the physical objects, because they didn't have the power from above. They just had the initiative from below. We, after the giving of the Torah, when we take a pair of tefillin and we write the scrolls on it and we make tefillin out of it, out of the hide of the animal, the actual physical hide of the animal now becomes a sacred object, like a Torah scroll, so on and so forth. But here's the question. Okay, he told Esav, I want you to know I've kept the 613 commandments. Why was that part of his message? Why is it important to let Esav know that I've kept the commandments? Why does Esav care? I mean, he's trying to make peace with his brother. Why this communication and this hidden message to his brother Esav, that I want you to know, even in the house of Laban, I did not deviate from the 613 commandments? And there are many answers given to this question. But I think that if you look at today, someone pointed out something fascinating to me the other day, which I sort of knew, but it clarified it, that October 7th was Simchat Torah, the day that the entire Jewish people started learning the Torah all over again. From in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, which is what we read on Simchat Torah. And in Israel, it was Simchat Torah, but also was one day before Simchat Torah. But the point is that as we're going through this tragic event, and all the unfolding aftermath, we're all starting to learn the Torah again. So we're all learning the Torah from the beginning as we go through this experience. So everything we're learning now is now being seen through a new lens. And, there are three A's that the Jewish people suffer from, three big problems. One is anti-Semitism. The second one is assimilation. And the third one is apathy. Someone said, what's the difference between ignorance and apathy? And they said, I don't know and I don't care, right? So these are the three problems Jews face: anti-Semitism, assimilation, and apathy. While anti-Semitism has risen greatly, at the same time, apathy has declined. You cannot be a Jew and be indifferent anymore. And assimilation has declined because we realize now we're not as welcome or accepted as we thought we are. People who are thinking of marrying out of the faith now have to ask themselves, what does my future spouse really think about Jews? And what does their family really think? Because a lot of people have been surprised to discover how many people they thought were their friends really are anti-Semites. So Jacob is saying to Esau, you may be seeking my destruction like anti-Semites, but I've held on to my Jewish identity, to my values, to my morals, to my ethics, to my spirituality, to my relationship with God. And therefore you should know that you're dealing with me, but not just the physical manifestation, the spiritual weight, so to speak, of my relationship with God, of my ancestors, of my values. That is where my strength and my conviction comes from. When you look at the Jewish people, and you can see this today as well, when we rise up against our enemies, one of our most potent weapons is our Jewish pride, our Jewish identity, our convictions, our faith. You see the soldiers and everyone, it's all about their faith and embracing their Jewish identity and observance of mitzvot, putting on tefillin on the front lines, tzitzit, and prayer and song. And that's really the story of the Jewish people. Jacob is not the strongest, so to speak. Esau has more military power. That's the story of the Jews against every nationality. The Babylonians, the Persians, everyone who came up against us. We have Hanukkah coming up next week. We're stronger and bigger. Look at tiny Israel compared to all the Arab nations around it. Our real strength is our spiritual strength. When you know what you are and who you are and what you're fighting for, and that you're on the side of light and goodness and righteousness, and God is blessing your efforts, you have an inner strength that is indomitable and indestructible. And that's what Jacob is saying from the very first conversation. He says, I want you to know I'm coming in the name of my ancestors, in the name of my faith and my relationship with God, of the fulfillment of the commandments. So don't think I am going to buckle. I'm going to, as Menachem Begin would say, I'm not a Jew with quivering knees. I will respect you. I will try to make peace with you. But if I have to, I will fight because I know what I'm fighting. I believe in what I'm fighting for. I think it was Martin Luther King who said, if you don't have something to live for, you don't have anything. Then how did he put it? He said, if you don't have something you're willing to die for, you don't have something you're willing to live. Then you don't have something you're willing to live for. Okay. Jacob said, I'm ready to fight. Maybe part of his way of making his brother think twice about who he is. Remember once hearing a story from Rabbi Shlomo Risko when he visited Palm Beach. I don't remember all the details, but basically, a lot of Hamas and Palestinian terrorists are in Israeli prisons. And the story was that there was a Palestinian Hamas terrorist in an Israeli prison, and he saw a Jewish inmate eating bread, pita, on Passover. I guess they made that available. People wanted it. I don't know. And something to the fact that this Hamasnik said, when I saw a Jew in prison eating bread on Passover, I knew we could defeat them, he said. Because if they don't have their faith, of their conviction, of their identity as Jews, if that's not strong to them, if their adherence to their religion is not strong, they will be ultimately conquerable. And perhaps he underestimated that a Jew is not only defined by his observance. The Jewish soul burns brightly in every Jew, the Pinta Liyid, even if he's not observant. He could eat bread on Passover, but he's just as Jewish in his soul. So he didn't understand that perhaps, but the sentiment he was conveying is truthful, which is that a Jew's not proud and strong in their convictions and their faith and their allegiance to Torah and to God, is not as powerful in their spirit, and therefore they are more conquerable, more susceptible to being defeated by an enemy, as opposed to what we're seeing today, which is the strong, spirited faith and love and unity and passion of Jews around the world. So apathy is corrosive. And Jacob's saying is, I'm not an apathetic Jew. I'm a passionate Jew. I keep all 613 commandments, even in the home of the wicked Laban. I was not influenced. I was not weakened in my faith and my observance of mitzvot. By the way, I always like to remind everyone, although this is over Zoom, I love questions. So if you have any thoughts or ideas or questions, feel free to share them with us, okay? So going along here to the next part. The angels come back, or the messengers, and they say, your brother's coming towards you, and he wants to kill you. And here the Torah says, Jacob was fearful and distressed. And a rabbi say, what does it mean, fearful and distressed? And Rashi gives the answer and says he was afraid lest his brother kill him. He was fearful what would happen to him and his family, but he was distressed lest he has to kill his brother in self-defense. So we know that in Judaism, there's an obligation to defend your life. If somebody comes to kill you, you have to kill them first, as we see the IDF doing right now. That is an imperative, a moral, religious imperative to defend Jewish life and protect your family and your own life. But it should always be done with a heavy heart. It's not something we gleefully or joyfully do. It's something we have reluctant to do, but have no alternative, no choice. And so Jacob says it's a lose-lose situation, because if I get killed, God forbid, that's tragic. I'm fearful of that. And if I kill him, I'm distressed that I have to kill him. Just like a soldier in the IDF doesn't want to kill anyone. He wants to live in peace with the Arabs. But we have no choice but to defend ourselves, because we have to survive and we have to kill our enemies if they're going to destroy us, God forbid. But here we see the Torah recognizing the idea and teaching us the idea that, sometimes in life we're looking for the perfect answer, we're looking for the perfect solution. And I think the Western mind, unfortunately, has this problem. Till today, people say, two-state solution. Well, if you heard son of Hamas speak in our shul the other week, he said, that's ridiculous. There's no room for a two-state solution with this kind of an entity. Maybe 20 years from now, 30 years from now, a new generation, if things change, maybe we could revisit it then. But in the Western mind, there has to be a solution. There has to be the perfect fix. Some problems can be solved. They can only be managed, unfortunately, right? And you have a cancer, God forbid, right? You can't necessarily cure it. You can't take it away completely. You could manage it. You could control it. You could send it into remission, but it could always come back. So tragically, when you have a cancer in your midst, like an enemy, unfortunately, there's no good choices. What Israel is dealing with now is not a good situation, obviously, but the alternative is much worse. And that's what the Torah is telling us, is that, when we have dilemmas, sometimes moral dilemmas, we sometimes looking for the good answer, the good solution. And someone said, great is the enemy of good, right? We want the great solution, but there's sometimes no great solution. Sometimes there's no good solutions even. Sometimes there's the lesser of the two evils, as we say. Which is the lesser of the two evils? Well, the lesser of two evils is right? And we all know all the issues with casualties and all the subjects surrounding war are very complex. But it's very easy to choose between good and bad, right and wrong. That's very clear. When you have to deal with degrees of bad, all the choices that the Israeli government has to make now with the hostages, the exchanges, letting out prisoners 3-for-1, halting the fire, all of this, these are difficult subjects, but we have to understand that life is not always presenting us with easy or clear choices. Sometimes, like I said, it's a choice of what is the less immoral choice, or the less violent choice, or the less evil, the lesser of the two evils, as we say. And by the way, I just want to jump ahead. Believe it or not, fascinatingly, there's another major story in this week's Torah portion down the road. We may get to it more in depth, but it's the abduction of Dinah. Believe it or not, there's a hostage taken in this week's Torah portion, and believe it or not, it's Jacob's own daughter. And very eerily, like the rapings that took place of the women in southern kibbutzim, Dinah was violated by a man by the name of Shechem. And we know what the conclusion of the story was from last year, obviously, that Jacob learns about this because Hamor, the father of Shechem, actually comes to Jacob with a proposal. Let's get married. My son loves your daughter. He took her by force, abducted her, violated her, and now he wants to marry her. And the two sons of Jacob, two of the tribes, Shimon and Levi, listen to this, and they're like furious, but they come up with a scheme. They say to Hamor, who is the leader of the country, the ruler, they say to him, listen, I'd love to marry into your family, become one big happy family, but there's one little problem. Your people are not circumcised, and we follow the tradition of Abraham, and you have to be circumcised. But if you circumcise yourselves, we'd be happy to marry into your family, and then our daughter, our sister in this case, can marry your son. Well, he goes back and instructs everyone in the place in Shechem to go ahead and circumcise themselves. And on the third day, when they're in pain from the circumcision, Shimon and Levi take their swords and wipe out all the men and redeem and free their sister from captivity. I don't know if she was being held in an underground tunnel, but they took her back. Now, there's a lot of commentary on this story, but before we even get to the commentary, we find a conflict in the family. When Jacob learns about what Shimon and Levi did, they didn't come to their father for his approval. They didn't come for his blessings. He's very upset at them, and he says, look what you've done. You've jeopardized the family in the hostile environment. The nations will take revenge against us. He's concerned about what they did. And on his deathbed, when Jacob dies, he actually brings up this story. And he says, Shimon and Levi, with your anger, you wiped out an entire city. With your ba'apam, with your rage and your anger, you wiped out an entire population. And he said, I'm going to spread you out in Israel so you will not be close to each other, because when you pair up together with your anger, you do very destructive things. So Jacob is clearly not happy with his sons for what they did. On the other hand, when he reprimands them, having discovered what they did, they say to him, listen, are we going to let our sister be treated like a harlot? And the Torah doesn't give us a clear conclusion about who is right and who is wrong. Was Jacob right? Torah presents his argument that with their anger, they destroyed a city. Maybe they went too far in their punishment, but they defend themselves, and the Torah presents their argument. We can't allow our sister to be violated like that. It has to be a clear message. This is unacceptable. It won't be tolerated. And the Torah leaves it open-ended once again, and the commentaries can't either agree. So, for example, famous dispute between Maimonides and Nachmanides. Maimonides says there's something called collective punishment, that all the people in the city approved of this behavior of their leader. They gave their approval, their tacit approval, and therefore they were collectively responsible. Nachmanides says, no, there's no justification for that. Yes. Every society has to implement law and order and judicial systems and justice and proper ethics and morals. But you can't hold the whole society accountable for what one person did. And it's left again open-ended in the opinions of Jacob versus the sons. Again, the Torah is showing us, the Torah is a book of lessons, of instruction. The Torah is not telling us who's right or wrong. The Torah is saying is that there's difficult questions sometimes, and there's no clear right or wrong. Okay, they're both right and they're both wrong, so to speak. As they say, the story, this guy having marriage problems, he comes to the rabbi, presents his case, the rabbi says, you're right. Then the wife presents her case, the rabbi says, you're right. So the rabbi's assistant, the gabbai, says, how could he be right and she be right? And the rabbi said, you're also right, right? Jacob's right, that what you did was maybe overreaching and endanger the family, perhaps. And they were right to say, well, we can't allow our sister to be treated this way. And again, I keep on going back to what's going on in Israel now and all the discussions, right? Now, IDF didn't go and wipe out all the citizens of Gaza, but there is a question of what is the collective responsibility of the society? Do they approve of their leaders? Do they celebrate these attacks against the Jewish people? And I don't have the statistics at my fingertips, but we know that there is large segments of the population, maybe even the majority in Gaza, that celebrated the events of October 7th. Now, I'm sure there are people who don't approve, but maybe they are afraid to speak up. But there are many that celebrated. Just like on 9/11, there were many Palestinians that celebrated the destruction of the Twin Towers and the killing of innocent people. So, there's the idea of a bystander, right? We had the same question in Nazi Germany, right? What is the accountability of the Nazis and their supporters, those who didn't object, those who went along with their regime, and therefore they are also accountable. If you are in a situation where you witness something done that's unjust or immoral, you don't have the option or the luxury to keep quiet. You have to say something. You have to do something. That's your obligation. And unfortunately, today, there's not one Muslim voice, except for son of Hamas, who's an ex-Hamas person who spoke at our shul. You don't hear Muslim leaders speaking out against the atrocities of October 7th. And that's failure, and they're accountable for that. So all of these difficult questions about violence are all come up in this week's Torah portion. And unfortunately, there's no other way to deal with violence than with violence. If somebody, you don't choose to be violent, but if somebody's coming against you with violence, what you have? You could either retreat and run away, which is not a good option, or you could just become subjugated to this person who's violent towards you, which obviously is terrible. Or your other choice is, no matter how peace-loving you are, you have to fight fire with fire. You have to come against power with power and show that your power is greater than theirs. And that's the only way you defeat them. So, it's not something we get an option sometimes. Person, well, I'm a peace-loving person. Well, if somebody, God forbid, and this is the analogy many Israelis were using on the media to explain, if somebody, God forbid, comes, God forbid, 100 times, starts shooting at your wife and kids, what are you going to do? You're going to shoot back. And if people get killed and innocent people are surrounding the terrorist, you have no choice. You have to defend your family. So Israel is a peace-loving nation. I don't have to convince anyone on this Zoom about that. We know that we want peaceful coexistence. We've always wanted that. That's our nature. That's our greatest prayer. That's our greatest desire. But sometimes our enemies leave us no choice. Just like Shimon and Levi felt they had no choice. And just like Jacob, who's confronting his brother in the beginning of the Parsha, recognizing that he has no choice but to be prepared to fight with his brother. There's another very, very beautiful passage in this week's Torah portion. And again, I always make a disclaimer. Every verse is beautiful. But there's a very famous verse where Jacob prays to God. And listen to the words of his prayer. He says, Katonti mikol hachasadim umikol hamet. God, I feel small. I feel diminished. I feel inadequate because of all the kindness and the goodness that you've done to me. You've been so kind to me. I left to the house of my uncle 20 years ago with my walking stick. I had nothing. And look at me now. I have wives and children and assets and flock, wealth. So God, you've been so good to me. But I need to ask you for another kindness to save me from my brother Esav. And our rabbis point to this verse and say, this is the way of the righteous. The way of the righteous is they always pray with humility, with gratitude. They say, God, you've already done so much for me. How could I even ask for more? But I pray that you help me once again, as opposed to those who pray with a sense of entitlement. In other words, the righteous always feel they're undeserving of all the kindness. And listen to the words of Jacob, katonti, I feel so small. In other words, when a person feels very blessed in life, they could either become arrogant and egotistical, or they could become smaller and smaller and humbler, meaning not small of feeling no self-esteem or self-worth, but feeling humble, like, why did God choose me for all this good? You know, it's funny, people always, well, I shouldn't say people always, but many times people ask, why me when they have a problem? Why me? But people don't often ask, why me when something good happens to them? Why did I deserve this blessing? Not everyone has this blessing. Why did I deserve good health? Why did I deserve good finances? Why did I deserve other blessings in my life, good children or whatever it may be? That we expect, that we sort of take for granted, as opposed to saying, God, you've done undeserving kindness with me. You've done more than, I always love to quote the guy I once asked, how are you doing? And he said, I'm doing better than I deserve, right? That's what Jacob sort of says. You've done so much for me already. It's just the way he prays. If you want to take it to a Hasidic interpretation, the Alter Rebbe in Tanya famously says that the light of the sun is seen when it's far away from the sun. But if you go to, the closer you get to the sun, the less you see the rays of the sun. Why? Because of the intensity of the light of the sun. So too, righteous people, the closer they are to God, the less they feel their own presence, the less sense, the less ego they have, the less I, the more humility, the more self-nullification, because they're like the rays in the sun in close proximity to the sun. So Jacob says, I feel God's presence so much that I feel so small. And that's a good feeling, not a bad feeling, actually, okay? It's sort of like your body. You know, when you're healthy, you don't feel your body. It's only when something's wrong that you feel your body. Same thing spiritually. If you feel your ego, if you feel yourself, if you're self-conscious and self-aware all the time, it's not a good sign. The less you feel yourself, the more humbled you are, the more you're like the rays of the sun in the sun, the more you're in what they call a state of flow. You're just a channel for God. And it's not about you. It's just about being a channel. Then that's obviously the higher spiritual plane. And that's what Jacob means when he says, I feel small from all the kindness and all the goodness that God has bestowed upon me. And he prays that God should save him from his brother Esau. And what does he do? He sends all these lengthy gifts and he spaces them out so the procession shall look even more elaborate as Esau is coming towards him. And before he meets his brother, there's an amazing story. One of the most famous stories in the Torah, a story that has ramifications till today. What do I mean by ramifications? So first of all, there's a prohibition that comes out of the story that we practice. But more famously, there's a name we carry. So what's the story? The story is that Torah says that he had taken his family, okay? He had 12 children, his wives. He took them all over the ford of the Yabok River, a certain river, as he was making his way back home. And as he crossed them over this river called the Yabok River, by the way, the only son that was not born yet was Benjamin. She's going to be born later. So as he's crossing over the Yabok River, he remains alone, the Torah says. Jacob remains alone. And suddenly a man attacks him and wrestles with him all night. Now, famously, Rashi says this wasn't a man, this was an angel. The archangel of Esau came to attack him and hurt him. An amazing story. Jacob prevails over this man or this angel. The man sees he can't win, so he struck the socket of the hip of Jacob. And Jacob's hip socket was dislocated as he wrestled with him. Then he says, let me go, for dawn has broken, which Rashi interprets he was an angel. He had to go back to heaven to sing the morning praises. And Jacob says, I'll will not let you go until you bless me. So the man says to Jacob, what's your name? This angel says, what's your name? He says, my name is Yaakov. He says, okay, your name shall no longer be Jacob, it should be Israel, because Israel means you wrestled with God and with men and you've overcome. And after this encounter, Jacob names the place where this happened Peniel, the face of God, because he said, I've seen the divine face to face, yet my life was spared. The sun rose for him as he passed Peniel, and he limped on his hip as he left. And therefore, the conclusion is, the children of Israel shall not eat the displaced sinew on the hip socket of to this day. When we have an animal that we slaughter and prepare for kosher meat, we have to take out the sinew, which is in the hip socket of the animal. It's called the gid hanasheh, the sciatica nerve. That's why we're told filet mignon is very expensive in kosher, because only special experts know how to remove that sinew. So the whole piece of the animal is taken out. Now, there's a lot to be discussed here. Let's start with the prohibition of eating the gid hanasheh. Very rarely, or maybe never, is there a story in the Torah with a commandment, a negative commandment as a result. There are many positive commandments, like, okay, the Jews were in the desert for 40 years, therefore you should build a sukkah. Or you ate matzah when you left, you should eat matzah. God created the world in 6 days, rest in the 7 days, therefore you should keep the day of Shabbos. But here you have a negative commandment, therefore you shall not eat the gid hanasheh, the sinew, in the hind quarter of the animal, the sciatica nerve. So what are we being taught by the story's prohibition, the result of not eating the gid hanasheh? There's a command, it's something we have to learn. So again, many interpretations, but one that I'd like to share with you is that the Torah is teaching us is that it says Jacob was alone when he was attacked. Now he had 11 sons and a daughter. Why was he alone? So the rabbis tell us that he had left something behind in the previous campsite, some pots and pans, some vessels, some objects, and he went back to get it, which in itself, a rabbi says, is an important lesson that Jacob was a wealthy man. Why did he have to bother retrieving a few little items? And the answer is that the righteous treat their possessions with respect and importance, meaning they value it, even though they may be wealthy, because it's the money of a Jew that was earned honestly and faithfully, and it could be used for a positive resource, for a positive purpose. So don't ever waste. Don't, even if you could afford to waste, don't, there's something called, we all know, there's a prohibition called Bal Tashlis, not to destroy anything that's functional or has a purpose to it, cut down trees with fruit or destroy vessels. But it doesn't mean you should be, God forbid, stingy. You should never be stingy, because that's not being generous. But it doesn't even mean that you should be miserly or what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to use the word cheap, but the point is, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't, that you should be, tight with your possessions. You should be generous and share them. But wasteful is never a positive thing. In other words, you should never discard things that have value, because even though you could afford it, there are many others that could appreciate it and enjoy it. So even though these vessels were just minor vessels, he went back to retrieve it in order to show that any possessions that could be used advantageously should be utilized and not be abandoned or just discarded. So that is one lesson about him going back to collect these random items. But what the rabbis tell us is that the lesson of not eating the hindquarter, to remember the story, is that Jacob's kids should have said, Dad, if we left something behind, will go back and get it. Why did they let their elderly father go get it himself? And therefore, the lesson is, don't leave your elderly parents alone. Don't let your father be vulnerable. As a child, the children should have gone to retrieve these items. And that's the lesson we always have to remember by not eating the Gid Hanasheh. That when we have elderly parents, and they don't have to be your parents, it could be any elderly people who are alone and they're vulnerable and they could be harmed. I always find it interesting that the most common thing when people are alone is when they fall, elderly people break their hip. So many times that's the beginning of a lot of problems. So he gets struck in the hip. So not eating the hind quarter of the man. Don't let your parents or any person be vulnerable to a harm. Now it could be from an attack, like in the story of Jacob, or just from falling or anything else. So that's the lesson of not eating the hind quarter of the animal. But what's the lesson of the story of Jacob wrestling with this figure and becoming Israel? That's quite an amazing thing, because till today, we're not with the children of Jacob, but more famously with the children of Israel, of Yaakov, who was renamed by this angel of Yisrael. And we have the land of Israel, and the people of Israel, and everything is Yisrael. What is it about the word Yisrael? So again, as you can imagine, there's mountains and mountains of commentary on this story. First idea I just want to share is that he asked for a blessing of this figure, because he said, if I had to struggle, and the Jews have always wrestled with different forces, we're going to extract the blessing at the end. We're not going to walk away without a blessing. Like after the Holocaust, we got the land of Israel. In other words, there always has to be a blessing. But the message of wrestling with man and with God is that we wrestle with man. We also wrestle within ourselves, with our own inner voices and godly soul, animal soul, but we also wrestle with God in this world to make this world a better place. And we know many great leaders wrestled with God. Abraham wrestled with God about Sodom and Gomorrah. Moses wrestled with God after the sin of the golden calf. As Jews, we are supposed to wrestle with God. Just like if your child offends another brother or sister, you're happy that your child is speaking up for another child. Unlike Noah, who just went into the ark and let the world get flooded, we're supposed to stand up, even towards God, and God welcomes that. So that's just the idea of being a Jew, Yisrael. But a very interesting interpretation given by the Rashbam is that